I was born and raised in Zambia, Southern Africa, one of the poorest countries in the world. And throughout my life growing up there, my formative years in high school, having been raised for much of my life there, I always was told that the path to economic success was through liberal democracy and through market capitalism. Over the past 10 years, I've had the privilege of traveling to over 80 countries around the world, rich and poor, democratic and non-democratic. And one thing has become absolutely clear. We who believe in democracy and market capitalism are no longer convincing. In fact, people around the world are no longer convinced that this is the path to economic success and human progress. So why are people skeptical? And I was telling my parents, I'd like people to think about what they'd say if they were at a dinner party or at a cocktail party, and people said, what is this skepticism about democracy? So what I'd like to do is give you a handful of bullet points as to why today people are more skeptical about the democratic process. In no particular order, voter participation rates are down. In the 1960s in this country, the average voter participation rate was around 65%, in some instances even higher. Today, the average in the United States is around 50%. Worse still, for people who are impoverished, so low-income households of $30,000 per capita per year have participation rates at around 30%. Clearly, this is much further away from the one man, one vote mantra that is supposed to define liberal democracies. A second problem is that money has seeped into the political process. According to a New York Times study, just 158 families in this country are responsible for over 50% of the contributions that were made, political contributions made for the presidential election in 2016. Over the past decade, we've seen lobbying amounts double from around $1.5 billion to today over $3 billion. And of course, with the decision at the Supreme Court for the Citizens United decree, we know that this is actually likely to get much worse rather than better. A third reason for skepticism is that people have lost faith in the political system. According to Pew, a think tank in the United States, 80% of Americans do not trust the federal government to do what is right on a regular basis. As a part of that, we know that the three pillars of political process, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, have now been called into question by many citizens. In the executive, the office of the president, the use of executive orders has increased not just with President Trump, but since President Clinton. Worse still, in terms of the legislature, which is essentially Congress, there's such a degree of combat and gridlock that people don't actually believe that the government is able to function. And in fact, the number of shutdowns and threats of shutdowns has increased over the last several decades. Finally, with respect to the judiciary and the criminal justice system, there is a real concern that there are essentially two political systems or two judicial systems. One for people who are white and or rich, and another system which applies for blacks, Latinos, other racial groups, and or people who are poor. This backdrop actually creates a lot of skepticism and reduces the amount of faith in the political process. Economically, it is urgent that we solve the political process, and democracy in particular. We need to rejuvenate and make sure that it's working. There are essentially two problems that I see in democracy today. One is legitimacy, the fact that there is a lot of skepticism about legitimacy of results. And it's not just about President Trump, it's about the Brexit result. People concerns about rerunning policies, not really trusting the system, as I mentioned earlier, particularly around the judiciary. But the second point, which I've already alluded to, is about this myopia, this mismatch between long-term economic problems that I mentioned to you a moment ago and the short-termism, the short-sightedness that we see in policymaking. Remembering that the public policymakers and politicians are very rational. They are simply doing everything that they must do in order to win votes. And that is essentially to court today's voter even though we know that there are enormous costs for future generations. Let me conclude by just saying one thing, which is the first sentence in the book, which is a quote that I found in disbelief, but it's so shocking and it's true that I decided it was going to be the first sentence in the book. It's a quote by Jean-Claude Juncker, who is the current president of the European Commission. Critical, important job. In fact, he's the sort of counterface of President Trump. And he said, "We all know what to do," meaning politicians. "We just don't know what to do, how to get reelected after we've done it." And I think that, to me, is really at the heart of the problem.
People often reduce your points of view to sound bites that make you sound very strident. And some of your views are very strident as well.
There's a few.
Some. So what do you think the biggest misperceptions are out there about some of the things you've written? Let's start with debt aid in terms of debt relief in Africa. What did people get wrong about the book, and maybe even me initially?
I should just say that I got absolutely killed during that process because people with very big names, Bono, Geldof, Bill Gates, really attacked me. They, in the case of Bono's organization, they rolled out to try and get momentum from Africans. The one thing that saved me, and by the way, I actually like all of them. In Bono's case, I really love his music. I just don't really want him designing economic policy, but that's by the by.
But one would argue that in their very significant points of view on the other side, it sold a lot of books.
Absolutely, and I've said this to you before. I mean, I think that the best thing for me was that they actually decided to attack me, because then people said, "What is this? What are you talking about?"
Did you feel attacked personally, or was it the ideas?
I thought that it did get to elements of, when they started calling Oxford and Harvard to see if I really went there, I don't know if they did it specifically, I kind of thought, okay, this is now becoming a little bit cheap. But we live in that kind of world. But can I just make this point that I think people fundamentally do not understand, and actually I'm stealing a line from President Kagame of Rwanda, who actually saved me because he wrote an 800-word op-ed in the Financial Times about my book. And he said, look, I don't agree with everything she said, but the truth is, as Africans, we always assumed that this aid thing was temporary. It's supposed to be a sort of a booster or some kind of a catalyst to help us grow economically. We didn't actually think it was permanent. But the most powerful thing he said is no one should assume that they care more about Africans than us as Africans ourselves. And I think that, to me, that there is sometimes, there's some sort of subliminal sense that maybe as Africans we don't care about ourselves.
So you think that's a misunderstanding in terms of the work?
Yes, I think that in general people think that for the work that I was essentially, pulling up the drawbridge. I grew up in Africa, as I mentioned, all my formative years, primary, secondary school, university, but also I've been sick in African hospitals, but very rarely do people ask Africans, what do you think we should be doing? How should we be more impactful? There's an assumption that, you're doing just fine, and therefore, you don't want other people to get aid. And that's just wrong.
What about on this book, where some might oversimplify that you are anti-capitalism?
Again, I've been accused of being neoliberal, and being doggedly capitalistic. I think it's people who are looking for a shorthand. That's just not me, and I'm just more interested in ideas, and particularly in the evolution of ideas and innovation. So I think it's a pity because, I suppose I could summarize my book in 140 characters, but I think there's a lot of nuance that's missed on. And I think it's an artifact of the world we live in. People don't have attention span. I've been in rooms like this where I've clearly articulated my view very recently on weighted voting, and I've said I'm completely anti anything that has any leanings of race or gender or wealth or IQ or education. And then I'll see a journalist write an article, somebody who was in the room, say, oh yes, and Dambisa supports an elite view that only people who are educated should. And I just think, well, they're just looking for a story, but that's just, it's chip shop paper the next day, is what they say.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic for our country?
I am optimistic, which is why I live here, because of all the countries I've been to around the world, it is the only country where, when they seem to be going the wrong direction, they reset, they reflect, and they shift the path in a way that I think other countries consistently learn from. And it's not just about politics and policy. It's about economics, it's about business, it's about education. I think there comes a point where Americans say that may be legal, but it just does not comport with us in a moral and an ethical sense, and we will just not stand for it. And to me, I think that has been the mainstay of what America stands for, and I think there are many examples of that happening today. The issue right now about gun control, I think, is an example of that, but there are many others. Pay equity, environmental concerns. They may be legal on the books, but it just doesn't sit well with us as citizens and and residents. And I think this is a country which says enough. We're not going to tolerate this, and we're going to move. And for me, that we have to eternally be optimistic for that.
So interestingly, quoting Bono, he says America is not a country; it's an ideal. It's an idea that is very important to the world. Would you agree with that?
100%.